Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the School of Visual Arts Theater. Thank you for being here. I suspect there's some people who intended to come, but they're across the hall with the VIP crowd. But they'll wander in as the evening goes on. My name is Stephen Fraley. I'm the chair of the BFA Photography Department. I just want to make a brief introduction of our guests this evening. And I also want to make mention that after the presentation, they will be in the lobby with the newly released book, and they'll be signing some copies. But before they begin, please allow me to introduce our guests, starting with Isaac Diggs. Isaac's work is in the collections of the New York Public Library and the Walker Art Center. His work has received support from the Asian Cultural Council, the Center for Photography at Woodstock, and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. He received an MFA from Bard College and has been on the faculty of the BFA photography program at SVA since 2000, which is absolutely astonishing. Edward Hillel has received many awards, including the German Critics Visual Arts Prize and the Golden Sheaf Film Award. His work is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the National Archives in France, among many other public collections. He is currently the founder and director of the Harlem Biennale. Last, but certainly not least, Vicki Goldberg was the photography columnist of the New York Times and has written numerous articles on photography for Vanity Fair and American Photographer. Her most recent book, Light Matters, is a collection of essays and was published by Aperture. Vicki has received the Infinity Award from the ICP in 1997. Please welcome all three of them here this evening.
I would like to tell you that the two photographers you see before you are a very unusual example of photographers because, for many reasons, one of them is they're essentially street photographers and it's a collaboration. Traditionally, street photography is single. Henri Cartier-Bresson was so reluctant to be known because he would be spotted that he didn't want his picture taken. And you can't do that when there are two of you wandering around. And can you imagine Walker Evans taking his worker pictures in Detroit with a sidekick? Or Deanne Arbus going out with somebody else? Or Frank? Or William Klein? I mean, it just scarcely happens. And besides that, they went out onto the street with a tripod and a 4x5, which is hardly something common either in street photography, which has been traditionally 35 millimeter, quick snap, snap. Now that everybody in the world is a street photographer, it's even harder to collaborate if you've got a cell phone. But besides that, there's a generation's difference in their age. That's not so uncommon. Aren't you different generations? I think you are. I'm a third one, for heaven's sakes. That you see that pretty often with photographers, somebody in midlife, somebody in their 20s, let's say. But that somebody is almost always an assistant. He's not photographing with you. He's carrying your lights and all your equipment. Excuse me. And then, you know, we have a black guy and a white guy who are photographing together out on the street in Harlem, and apparently that sometimes drew a crowd, which I find not so very surprising. Only one of them could photograph at a time under a black cloth, but still they would spend up to an hour beforehand deciding what lens to use, where to stand, what angle to use, what f-stop to use, et cetera, and so forth. So it was a real collaboration. And if you haven't seen the book, you ought to, because it's a really good book. Now, do you want to open with a photograph? Oh, you've got one.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Vicki, for being here. Thank you to SVA and to Stephen, especially for long supporting my work and now my collaboration with Edward. As you said, I've been teaching here since 2000, and I'll be forever grateful for the opportunity you gave me in grad school to teach. So thank you. But yeah, we wanted to just start out showing work that we had been doing independently in Harlem specifically before meeting, because I think one of the interesting things about our collaboration is that we each have had many, many years thinking about Harlem, visualizing Harlem before we actually came together to work in Harlem. So as Vicki alluded to earlier, I moved to Harlem in the mid-90s and started off very much in that solitary photographer walking the streets of Harlem, making black and white 35 millimeter pictures. And I started doing that simply because I moved to Harlem. I moved to New York in 1990 to go to college on the Upper West Side. Upon graduating in '94, I moved to Harlem, and I was there. And it was suddenly an opportunity to not only investigate a neighborhood that I was very much attracted to, but also a way to practice using a camera. I didn't study photography as an undergraduate, so my late in college decision to pursue photography seemed a bit rash to my father, but upon graduating, I really had to figure out what that meant. So I got a job at Magnum Photos in their administrative offices in Chelsea, and would use my lunch period and after work to peruse the contact sheets that were there. So Cartier-Bresson, Salgado, etc. You know, I just kind of poured over their contact sheets and started making pictures. And I would do what I called a daily practice. Every morning before work, I'd get out and walk the streets of Harlem for a couple of hours. And then on the weekends, I would do the same, just to make photographs. I had no specific intention, no project per se, no book or exhibition idea. It was just a way to make pictures. And I really was attracted to the activity, the kind of public display of culture on the street. So I was very attracted to the signage, obviously, to the people, to the objects one would just simply come across walking through Harlem. And of course, in the mid-90s, Harlem was relatively neglected, especially in terms of the rest of the city. I mean, I can remember vividly looking at New York Magazine, maps of Manhattan would stop at 96th Street because nothing was going on above 96th Street, according to them. So Harlem was largely neglected. But in the later 90s, early 2000s, there was certainly an increase, an uptick in activity in terms of interest in the area. And I just really continued to make these pictures of public events, private moments, things that drew my attention. In early 2000s, like 2004, I believe, I got a grant to go to Japan through the Asian Cultural Council to study with Daido Moriyama for about 10 weeks. And that was really pivotal to me. I'd been thinking a lot about Moriyama's street photography and the example of Japanese post-World War II photography and how transformational that had been. And I really wanted to study with him to see how his thinking about a language of photography could be translated in America, specifically to an African-American context, and thinking about how I might visualize what we're now thinking about as black space. So many of these pictures, some of them were made kind of 2004, 2005, upon coming back from that trip and really being more aware and conscious of the images I was accumulating and what they were saying in aggregate in terms of talking about African-American culture, talking about a specific place with a tremendous amount of history and culture that was kind of rapidly changing. In 2006, I moved out of Harlem. I moved upstate. And this kind of street work basically stopped. I was no longer living here. I no longer had the kind of daily access to the place that I once had. But Harlem was still on my mind, and I was kind of anxious to figure out a new way to approach it. And thankfully, it was around that time that I met Edward.
Hello, everyone. I also want to thank Stephen and SVA for being our de facto partners. Thanks to Isaac being here since we started this project in 2008. I'll just talk about the work my contact with Harlem as well. And I was looking through my archives to prepare for this talk and discovered that my earliest pictures dated the same time that you started working here, which was in 1990. Now, I wasn't living in Harlem. I grew up in Canada, and I was starting to live in Paris. I was going back between Montreal and Paris, and I I'd heard a story about a Japanese jazz singer who was coming to Harlem to study and to become the Ella Fitzgerald of Japan. So I got really interested in the story and came to Harlem to look for her and to make a film about her. And so these first images were just my wandering around, starting to look for spaces and just to get a sense and a feeling for the musicality of the space, since the film I was going to do was really about musical experience of Harlem and this kind of cultural exchange between Japanese and African American cultures. My first contacts of Harlem was very much as an idea and as a place that inspired other people. I'd met some famous musicians when I was in my teens while living in Montreal, people like Muddy Waters and Willie Dixon and John Lee Hooker, and they would talk to me about Harlem as if it was their home. And it was only later when I started studying and researching their stories that I realized they weren't from Harlem. So Harlem to them was just this kind of epic place. So these first photographs were just what I was experiencing in the week or two that I would have been here scouting and meeting the people who would then become part of the film. I look back at these pictures now. I just really rediscovered them about a month ago, and they're Kodachromes. And now, so I look at them with different eyes. I look at them as relics and as a way of seeing how film really impacts the way something looks and the way something feels. So this is Miki, and the basis of the film was that she competes at amateur night at the Apollo, which is a tradition that goes back, what, about 30 years, I think? Longer. And so we kind of constructed the story around that idea and used that idea to explore Harlem. So then, I guess in early 2000s, so this photograph starts 16 years after the other photographs were done. So in 2003, I had, after living in Paris, I'd moved to New York and wanted, of course, to live in Harlem because of the memories I had of the place. And I started photographing with a medium format film camera. And so these photographs have a much more formal, I think, detached element, but we're still dealing with film here. And I think they have much more of a distanced idea of starting to look at cities and how layers and layers accumulate and give you different signs and different stories embedded in them. You know, this one of a Dutch boy, of course, Harlem having been first a kind of a Dutch outpost, and you know, so stories looking at walls. So some of these ideas, I think, started to seep into the work that Isaac and I started to do together, and I also started to realize that the color palette we were looking for in making the 4x5 prints were very much, for me, connected to these early photographs. In 2006, the Mayor Bloomberg zoned Harlem, and specifically 125th Street, and it was the first time in the history of New York and Harlem that there was a zoning. And of course, the zoning created a lot of conversation around memory, what would happen to the communities that built Harlem, what would happen to the remnants of the Harlem Renaissance, the Apollo, and also, but excitement about the possible changes. And so the work started taking on more kind of inquisitive political questions, and I started to participate in some of the demonstrations and conversations that were going on in Harlem about the changes to come. And it was at that time that Isaac and I met and started thinking about working together. I think, Isaac, you had just, you started thinking about a 4x5, and that's when you purchased a 4x5. You want to just...
Yeah, well, during that period, I had started to think about my kind of photographic education, so to speak. And having just come out of graduate school and thinking about photography in a way that was interdisciplinary, you know, talking to poets, talking to filmmakers, talking to sculptors, painters about photography was a wonderful thing. It opened up my mind tremendously to different currents, different thoughts around art making and process. But I realized that I didn't really possess a kind of formal understanding of what it meant to take a picture, at least in the way that I wanted to understand that. So that in part led to my thinking about getting a large format camera as a way to slow down and think about those formal choices, you know, that we all make when we make a photograph. And I really wanted to kind of steep myself in that for a couple of years. And it was around that time that we then started to, you know, make these pictures.
Edward, had you thought about taking 4x5 pictures before that?
I had used the 4x5, but not as to photograph something real, but to use the 4x5 as a way to enlarge larger images. So I was appropriating imagery from archives, from films. I would use a 4x5 and photograph a television screen, and then, you know, make a blow-up 4x5 feet, and so start thinking about where is the image being carried? Is it in the pixel? Is it in that abstract space? So I was thinking about how images are used to transform memory, to tell stories. I was thinking about the photography as material as well. So I was using a 4x5 to achieve those kinds of processes.
And you were still using, the two of you were still using film as long as you could get film in the 4x5, right?
Yes, yes. All of these were made with film and then scanned, ultimately,
Yeah.
and digital prints were produced.
And did you have to, I mean, you were doing a lot of alterations at once. You were moving into another kind of camera. You were moving into another collaboration. You were, I don't know whether you had the same ideas about what the final message should be or not. Did you discuss that among yourselves a lot?
Well, this first picture, if you can scroll back one, yeah, is a good example of an early photograph that we felt worked. And we were both excited because it seemed to bring together the kind of formal qualities that we were interested in with that sense of timing and spontaneity that I particularly was interested in trying to achieve with a 4.5. I had been thinking quite a bit about what would it mean to use a 4.5 as a 35 millimeter camera? What would it mean to use a 35 millimeter camera as a 4x5? Just in terms of how you would approach using the tool, and you know, setting up a shot like this, and then kind of waiting as one might on the street for something to happen to kind of fill the container, so to speak, was something that I think we kind of nailed in this particular picture. So, kind of from a formal aspect, it was successful for me, but also there are all these other things kind of happening in terms of the life of the place that's captured in the M&G diner sign, or in the pharmacy, pharmacia, in the African hairdressers in the background who are looking at the white cyclist in the foreground. You know, all of those things are kind of happening in the picture that I think speak to the layering that we were going after in the best of the photographs.
I think layering is a very good word for this picture, because it seems to me that it accordioned. It's a lot of planes that got put together. It's hard to tell where the traffic light is, but it's behind this little sign. I don't know. I expect you can see it down at the right-hand side. It says, "Believe and achieve." And there's a lot of Harlem in that is sort of got a spiritual aspect. It's the mixed population, as you pointed out. It's the busyness that happens in congested modern cities where the signs all butt up against one another and are sending different messages, and you have to pick and choose because you can't absorb them all at one time.
Yeah, I think that's those are all good comments. I think what we were thinking about was how to photograph with that social space in mind, with the political conversation that would impact Harlem for the next 100 years, which is a conversation that's just starting. So we didn't want to just follow the rules of the 4x5. We wanted to have the benefits of the 4x5, but continue to think about social and political space, which what street photographers do. I mean, that's...
There's a very interesting little study in color and reproduction going on here. I've seen this picture 100 times, never quite this big, but and I'm looking at it on the screen. It's very different from looking at it on this screen. And we all experience color differently anyway, but a book is a different medium from a print, and a projection is a different medium from a book, et cetera, and particularly in color, that trying to find some way in a reproduction of making it respond to the kind of color you were looking for when you did it is very difficult.
Yeah, that was really very frustrating at the book stage. It was my first time making a book, and I was very committed to being on press. That was like, I've got to be on press, got to be on press, got to be on press. When that involved, well, now we're going to print in China, in Hong Kong, excuse me, as opposed to Montreal, suddenly being on press was less a possibility. And so going back and forth with the printer, looking at test after test after test after test was very, I think that was probably one of the toughest parts of the whole project, trying to get it right, because you realize this was your shot. You mess it up and it's messed up.
But getting it right with the color photograph is an ambiguous thing anyway. Do you get it in the way you think it was? Do you get it in the way you feel about it? Do you get it in the way you like the color balance? I mean, there's so much else going on. In black and white, you've got all sorts of things. Are you going to use grainy paper? Are you going to print it dark? You're going to print it light? But it seems to me in color, it's really complicated. And the two of you probably have very different eyes, because all of us do. And was that ever contention between you?
Yes.
I thought that was going to be the answer.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, we have, and one of the things that Edward brought to the table that I really appreciated was a real ability to kind of push the envelope of photographic color. I mean, I'm more of a purist that I want the color to look like I saw it, you know? What I mean, Edward is very comfortable kind of pushing color to what for me was a little, you know, at times it's like, okay, we got to dial this back. But, you know, that's what collaboration is about, and I really appreciate his making me stretch as far as how to think about color and the palette, especially when it came to making the prints. And it's something people always comment on in looking at the prints in terms of how vivid the colors are and how much that, in some ways, reflects their experience of Harlem.
Well, Vicki, you must think about those issues as a writer. I mean, it's because with color you're already it's highly subjective. I mean, you could think about color in an impressionistic way. You could think about it in an expressionistic way. So the choices you make are extremely important in how the viewer is going to experience that image. You know, this image in a different way. You know, in color or black and white would give you a completely different feeling.
Yeah, that's true.
So those are choices that I've always, in my experience, just allowed the project itself to determine what color palette it should take. So those decisions for us were made after the photographs were made. We made very few prints until we made most of the photographs, final prints. In the meantime, Isaac basically procured a scanner, a film scanner, learned how to use it, which is no easy task, in a year, and started scanning these high-level scans. And then, you know, I started looking at how to deal with color in post-production using digital methods, no darkroom. So already we're talking about several transformations. At that point, you start to get a sense, well, what is the color space of this body of work?
Well, but you say as a writer, I must think about it. Yes, don't they say that the Inuit have something like 30 different words for snow? Well, how many words do we have for blue? My husband thinks the things are green that I am certain are blue. And so, we could find something else to quarrel about, but that's sort of a favorite. But, all right.
That's pretty good after all those years.
This, I think, is really telling. It's not just the zoning that's doing this to Harlem, but of course Columbia University has got, what, a 25-acre plot that Renzo Piano has designed a park for, and designed a huge arts center that's going to be in 125th Street. And every time that Harlem has been gentrified, which happens with some regularity, some corner gets gentrified, some other one crumbles, people get evicted because the rents go up. And you see, dear Columbia, no forced displacement. They're really worried about it, and they probably have reason. And I was wondering to what extent you thought about that as well as the formal and aesthetic things. Did you really have in mind before you started this project? I know you were going to try to preserve something that was going to change, but did you have any sense of what that would do for the place, or for the future, or for what you were hoping for?
Well, I found it interesting looking at Isaac's pictures, because I hadn't seen them really until he made his selection, that your last picture of that, what was it, a barber shop, at the bottom there was a sign saying, Harlem not for sale. And then, those last group of pictures that I showed with the people holding the signs that were highly saturated color was Harlem, something like that. So these issues have been, part of Harlem's history, since the 60s and 70s. That really was what drove us to take on the challenge of working together. We felt there was something more than photographs to be made here. There was a real turning point, because the difference between a building going down and being rebuilt and a zoning plan that impacts the life of a city, like Robert Morris, how he changed New York. Zoning of Harlem is going to change Harlem permanently over a multi-generation period. So we were no longer into incremental change. We were looking at a specific decision to start thinking about what America is going to look like, what New York City is going to look like in the 21st century. And so the reason why we were able to get so many of these pictures, we've said it often, is that there was a recession. And so the recession stopped 10 or 15 projects from getting started. The banks just wouldn't lend any money for these projects. The recession has now lifted, and today there's $1.5 billion in construction already in place in Harlem. So images like this will disappear. This kind of space where you could see from the Cotton Club to an empty lot to the Hudson River to New Jersey will probably not be there. In fact,
yeah, quite literally,
yeah.
It is no longer there. I mean, between this image and this image, we probably made them within months of one another. But while we were working on this project, this entire block was raised. I mean, all of those buildings that you see, the foreground building, the blue awning, the brown, the white brick, those are all demolished to make way for a new Columbia development. And that's happening from 125th up to, what, the 140s? And however you feel about that, good thing, bad thing, ambivalent thing, it's happening. And it's radically changing how people understand their neighborhood, their environment. So those are the kinds of things that we kind of wanted the work to address. Not in a kind of didactic way. I mean, yes, we were compelled to go out because we knew the neighborhood was going to change. That was just, it was a done deal. How it was going to change was up to some debate. But we wanted to kind of chart those changes, to kind of lay it out there so that people could see, so that there'd be some kind of testimony to what had been there.
Of course, that project for street photographers has existed at least since the emperor commissioned Charles Marville to take pictures of the parts of Paris that the Baron Haussmann was going to destroy. And it happened with Thomas Annan in the closes of Scotland. And Aceh was photographing a Paris he knew was going to disappear under the threat of modernism because there was going to be traffic, et cetera, et cetera. But Robert Morris made changes that were permanent. Robert Morris, when he built the West Side Highway and his whole West Side project, he put, I cannot remember how many, but parks, the entire length except for Harlem. And he also made it clear that they couldn't have one because he took the road down by the water's edge and put those great arches up so they could have it elevated, which would make a lot of rumble and noise and dirt going over Harlem as well. I mean, he was not a nice man. He was a great builder, but he wasn't a nice man.
Well, it was a different conception of the city. You know, the city ended, the city pretty much ended north of Central Park, and so the rest was, it was still, I mean, race played a big, you know, issue in what New York was looking like at the time. I think there was a kind of all that third of Manhattan was left to its own wits, which is what makes a lot of places great. Leave them to their own wits.
Yes.
So.
Well, but Morris really did a great deal far north of Harlem. I mean, he put over the Hudson Bridge, which he said was going to stop traffic, which it did not. But he destroyed a couple of wonderful wooded areas, and so it was. For him, it was the entrance to Manhattan. It was a beautiful entrance full of luxurious parks that the middle class could get to easily, but neither the poor nor the blacks could get to it with such ease. And there's a real question today about this whole business about gentrification and development. I happened to be reading Robert Carroll's book on Robert Moses, and there's a little thing he says in here that, if you don't mind, I will read a piece of it. If you haven't read The Power Broker, which had its 40th anniversary this year, you ought to, although it'll take you a lot of time, but it's awfully good. But Carroll says, when Moses is thinking about public parks, not so much the whole space of a city or whatever, but he doesn't think about the space of the city. And Carroll says that a public space must be planned not only in terms of itself, but in terms of its environment, the neighborhood in which it is located. It had to be judged not only in physical terms, but also in social terms, in terms of its effect on the human beings who had to live around it. I mean, that's part of what's going on here in your photographs, it seems to me. And it's been around ever since. I don't believe that Haussmann or which emperor was it, the third? Napoleon the Third? I can't remember. Anyway, but I don't think that they thought or cared about the people who lived in these rundown places. They were going to be displaced and put someplace else. In fact, they made new slums out of it. That often happens.
Well, it remains to be seen, you know, how developers are thinking about the issues you bring up around how do people who are living there actually going to interact with these new buildings or the loss of space. I think as you've seen New York City become a place where international investors can park their money safely, there's a real disconnect between development and the people it immediately impacts. So as you see 125th, you know, becoming another location for an Applebee's or a Staples or, you know, any other national brand, you know, the question becomes, well, how does that affect the mom and pop store that was there or that business? How does culture get reflected through the buildings and spaces through 125th Street, which is the main, or at least was, cultural and political corridor of Harlem? So I think those questions are really, you know, the answers are still kind of floating out there.
Yeah, and most important, what is our role
It's a big question.
artists, photographers, thinkers, people who care about place. What is our role? How do we act upon a space? How do we create a conversation that will open up the discussion? And we are hopeful, you know, that a project like this will have the bankers and the developers looking at these pictures and thinking, well, this is a different community than being out in some empty suburb, some farmland, and putting up housing tracts. You know, this is something that has to be thought about within the place. So, you know, you think about these things.
Well, I notice, of course, that you've photographed the great monuments like the Cotton Club, the Apollo, the Victoria, etc. What's the name of the senator with three? Adam Clayton Powell. Adam Clayton Powell.
That's it. That state building is in that corner of that photograph over here.
Yes. Well, there's another wonderful photograph of this monument, and there was a photograph one of you took of there we are, of a great huge crowd. I thought that might be there.
That was the same street corner, one of Isaac's black and white photographs.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Of course, Adam Clayton Powell is here climbing up towards heaven. Along his route, he has to pass the Hotel Teresa, which was the famous hotel in Harlem where Castro stayed in 1960.
Because you couldn't stay anywhere else, because no one else would.
There were sirens going up and down Park Avenue as he was driving up there. But also the state building that was built there and where Adam Clayton Powell is commemorated was a building that he was so opposed to, he said he was going to leave the country if they built it. Instead, he got monumentalized.
That was the beginning of the office, this Adam Clayton State Building, right?
Yes, that's
built
right.
in 1970, and
Yeah.
that's right. But that building, you know, which is so important to the life of Harlem, because all the three political layers of government are there, a lot of community groups are there. It also set the standard for the zoning that then was created in 2007. Because it's 30 stories, 125th in those pockets was zoned 30 stories. And that was one of the points of discussion and contention. Can we bring it down to 15 or 16? Could we then ask developers for each extra floor, they would give us some community space. These conversations are not over. So this is an ongoing process, and it's entirely possible that when these buildings are done, thanks to the conversations that have taken place, there will be a lot of cultural space on 125th as part of the agreements that were made with the developers.
Yeah, I thought Columbia had said that that great arts center was going to be open to the public, that this huge building.
Columbia is building a museum.
Yeah.
A contemporary art museum right on 100, actually right where that photograph we had on earlier, right in that spot.
Yeah. I mean, another thing, too, about just this image and, say, the one prior, is that in thinking about how to visualize 125th Street, it was really important to us to photograph the same locations, the same street corners, even the same buildings, from different vantage points to kind of reflect on or really pose the question of, you know, how best does one see a particular building or a particular place? You know, so this street corner pops up and other street corners pop up repeatedly in the book, not only because we're limited to 125th Street, but also very consciously thinking about, well, you know, what happens if you move across the street and look in a different direction? Or what happens if you get high and shoot low, or vice versa? So those things became very important. This block, corner, Lexington and 125th, is one of the most frenetic on 125th Street for various reasons. I mean, the subway pops out there, the bus stops there, you have fast food places all around, there's a clinic around the corner, you know, so there's a lot that happens on that street. And so this corner, this intersection in particular, became a place where we could just kind of set up shop and work all day, you know, moving around to see what might happen.
In effect, you're saying that we put some of our contact sheets out there. We, you know, if everybody's got to photograph 2 or 3 times a subject, and if you did that, you were going to print them and see if they didn't look different from different angles. This photograph is kind of my experience of 125th Street. Whenever I've been there, I don't live there, but whenever I've been there, it's been chaotic in some way. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of people going someplace, coming from someplace. There's this cacophony of fire escapes and street signs and advertisements and people with their babies or people expecting babies. It's just all right there. It's like the city, the contemporary city could be located right at that corner so far as I'm concerned.
Also, I mean, many of these photographs, we'd been to that location on several occasions, and then we would either decide not to set up, because setup time is quite lengthy.
Yeah.
And would the light change in the meantime, and what was the feeling? That exactly what you say, it's what you feel in a space, right?
Yeah.
We feel a city. We don't see it. We don't observe it. We're in it. It's a kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk, it's kind of a total artwork, a city, right? So, so we were kind of looking for those moments that would take us to the next level. Okay, let's set up, let's decide on lenses, in some cases like this, people are talking to us. They're saying, well, what are you doing? So let's engage in conversation, and then let's disappear so we can make the photograph.
You told me that sometimes people came up and said they suggested another f-stop or they suggested another lens, and other times people wondered what the hell you were doing under a black cloth out there with a tripod.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very different experience working with a large format camera, having worked with a smaller one where people are initially suspicious. Why are you walking around taking pictures and then turning away, and who are you with the police, basically, was the question. So working with a tripod, you were just out in the open, you were exposed. And the fact that it took so long, anyone who had questions could approach you or decide to move. So if they didn't move, if they didn't approach you, there was an understanding that they were cool, and that you could just go about doing what you were doing. And I think we also looked official. like we they must be working for the city or something, or maybe they're surveying for something. But yeah, it was very cool. It was a conversation starter. Yeah. I don't think we had one negative experience. No. In terms of someone being very confrontational or aggressive around what we were doing.
Didn't you tell me you were out in the middle of the street for one picture?
Yes, I think that's kind of coming up. But one photograph, we were approached by the police who were suspicious. They were driving by in their patrol car, and it's like, what are you doing? And we showed them a mock-up for the book, for the project, and they asked if they could stop traffic so we could take a picture. So it just kind of worked out well.
It's just very funny.
Yeah.
Well, when Bruce Davidson went up to East 100th Street, they were very suspicious. They had what was called the Metro North Committee. And the Metro North was north of Metropolitan Hospital. And it was a citizens committee, and because they felt that Harlem had been promised so many things, and none of them had ever happened. Everybody campaigned, we're going to change this, we're going to change that, we're going to give you better housing, we're going to take care of it, we're going to toss out the dirty landlords who are letting your buildings go to pot so that they can then sell them at a higher price or whatever it was. And so he said he would take some pictures and they could decide on that matter. And he did, and they liked them, and they said fine. And he hung out a very long time. When he had finished, there was a woman who was an activist in the community, and she started trundling those pictures around to every single city agency. And they did begin to get things done. Photographs still can make a difference, and one hopes indeed that even these may. I mean, combined with, you've been activists in effect, combined with the kind of discussions that you say are going on, it always helps to have some sort of proof. You bring in somebody who lives there, or you bring in a photograph of the way things look, or whatever you do, and see if something doesn't happen along those lines. The city, I think, has promised that if they allow people to put up apartment buildings, there have to be a certain number of affordable units. Isn't that true?
Yes. Affordability is very important. And now that we have, we have de Blasio, some of those issues might come to the forefront. Yeah, that's very important. I mean, one thing you could say about Upper Manhattan is it's really going to remain that diverse, multi-racial, multi-class community. I don't think that's going to change simply because of the number of public housing units that there are, which today represents about 1/3 to 40% of the population. That's not going anywhere. And I think, although there are conspiracy theories that say that there are plans to privatize all of them, and who knows? I mean, there are all kinds of there's all kinds of noise about that. But for the moment, I think that's pretty much the future of New York for the next 50 years, probably. So that gives us this wonderful space, which is, like I was saying, 1/3 of Manhattan's geography, with which to think about creating a new kind of community, a community that is diverse, that is multicultural, and that in some kind of utopic way represents 21st century America.
I'm wondering about your choice of a book. I think the media in general have changed so radically. And I think books, I'm not sure books could make the same difference. Perhaps they can. I'm not certain that photographic books can make the kind of difference that, for instance, East 100th Street may have made because it got into the hands of an activist. I mean, nothing works alone. You have to have something to go with it. But did you decide that you would rather have that old-fashioned wonderful thing called a book rather than a site on the web, for instance?
Well, I think for us, we could have both, and that's the wonderful thing about this project. Yes, we were very committed to having a book. I think as photographers, and speaking personally, there's a special place for a book. A project feels realized, done, when it's been put in that form. But we also have an ebook that is available and that was done by Restless Books, and it incorporates video, it incorporates other imagery, it incorporates a bunch of other aspects of the project that it would have been much more difficult to include in a conventional book. So that can live on your tablet. That's online. We have a project website. I mean, I think it's what's been wonderful is that it lives in many different ways. There's the exhibition where people can see these things in a much larger size and really get into the detail. So I don't think it's one or the other, but thankfully because of the tools available, we can do multiple things and put it out in various formats, thinking along the way that it's a new thing. It's not simply about translating the book to the wall or translating the print book to the ebook. It's like, how can these specific things further an understanding of the project, an understanding of kind of Harlem. So that's been really gratifying.
I didn't even know about the ebook. What's the site? Tell these people how to get it.
You can go to iTunes basically and just look up 125th Time in Harlem. Or go to Restless Books. They're the ebook publisher, and you can find it. You can find it there. I love that you can go to iTunes again.
Yes. Is there music?
In certain sections, and there's a new essay in addition to yours by Greg Tate. Some of you may know the cultural critic Greg Tate, who's a longtime resident of Harlem, a musician, and also a cultural theorist who wrote a new essay for the book.
Nice. Incidentally, this photograph I find very interesting. This is one this incredible arch, which is now rusting and whatever, holds up the subway, does it not?
Yes.
The one line.
Yeah. So there's an elevated subway there, and what you see through it, which says HIV stops with me, of course there has been, historically, in fairly recent history, there was more AIDS in Harlem even than in the theater district, which is really going some. And there were conspiracy theories about that, that it was a white program to wipe out the blacks. I mean, we have crazies all over America, but it's that advertisement takes over this building. I mean, there's this enormous part of this building that is an ad for safe sex. And everybody who passes by there, you can really scarcely miss it. You have to be walking like this not to see that ad. And if you're underneath this subway, which is from another era when that supposedly didn't exist, or wasn't here at least, you are looking at the present through the past in some way in this picture.
Well, that's a lot of what the experience of Harlem is. I'm looking at layers upon layers of the passage of time, whether it's kind of architectural or, as you've said, looking at this billboard. And very early on, we were attuned to the messages that were coming through the billboards, because maybe outside of Times Square in Manhattan, there are very few places where you are so continuously confronted by advertising. Whether it's for the latest athletic shoe or for safe sex or for, whatever the case may be. So even as these billboards changed, we were aware of that being part of the message, signage, language, that functioned not only literally but symbolically too, like what's on the mind of not only the people who are trying to reach, who are marketing to Harlem, getting back to that, what's the idea of Harlem that can be synthesized in an ad for liquor or an ad for a tennis shoe? Like, what's the idea of Harlem that goes back to the Renaissance or to some, night at the Cotton Club, sophistication, allure, sexiness, whatever the case may be, and what is the message kind of on the street that's being lived out in day-to-day life? So the kind of tension created by those two things, I think we were able to really latch on to by paying close attention to the signs.
Well, I hear you about Times Square, than which there is no more clotted area. But I do think there are a lot of big billboards. I mean, a man named Wouter de Ruyter, who is actually Belgium, made a whole book about the signage in New York, about the mammoth billboards. You would think it was an illiterate society. They could read 3 words maybe, and so you put them up on a poster. But the buildings are dissolved in some way, either by signs or by a glass curtain wall, so that the city becomes really a different kind of organism than it used to be. And there's not much glass curtain wall in Harlem, but you do see there was one which had that whole figure slouching, the designer male clothes.
This image here, Sean Combs, P.
Yes,
Diddy. Yep,
yes. Oh, sorry, I wasn't even looking at it. Yeah, that's
So
right.
that's the same spot as the AIDS, the other
It's
poster.
across the street, right?
No, it's basically the same building.
You want to go back to the other one?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
let's
Same
flip back.
building?
It's the
I
same
went-
building,
From
just
another side?
well,
One was shot from the subway, the other one,
Yeah.
and this one's shot from under it.
but different,
Diff- so-
different
There must be-
days, obviously.
Well, you mean the sign had changed?
Yes,
Oh, I see.
exactly, exactly.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's very profitable for landlords, of course, to rent
Yeah.
out their public space. So again, this is something that cities have to think about what they want to look like, right? Because these are legislated issues, whether that space should be used and what the views are. And so we were very aware, of course, that signage tends to take over a lot of photographs when you're photographing cities, especially dense vertical cities. And we were aware of the photographs of Bernice Abbott, this wonderful series of photographs, a lot of signage, and Walker Evans. But so we were thinking about these issues, but also the idea of how then to come back to the social questions, the contemporary questions that Harlem is asking.
Yeah. This image here is one of the few that's specifically about an event. This was days after the death of Michael Jackson, and outside of the Apollo, they erected a wall. Well, that construction wall had been there, but people started to write basically messages to Michael and leave flowers, etc. But in getting slightly higher and looking across, you see this beautiful like green space that you don't see from the street. that we thought was so incredible. And, you know, this is kind of what it's become. This image isn't in the book, and it's not necessarily part of the series, but it just gives you a sense of now what has replaced that and what is coming. Again, I don't know positive or negative, but it's the same space.
The second picture is what
Yes.
used to be this greenery?
Yes. Well, what's now the greenery is here.
Well,
So, I mean, it's kind of just radically changing.
in a very short time. I mean, we worked on this, what, 2 years?
From 2008 to 2012, roughly. I mean, after making the photographs, we had another 2 years of kind of post-production.
But you photographed for 2 years, and during that time, this happened?
No, our photographs go from 2008 to 2012. You see at the end of the book you have...
What, you didn't take 2 years after that to do the book?
Well, the book came out now.
The publisher takes that time, but you don't take all that time.
Well, we are the publisher.
Oh, I take it back.
You know, making that book was an extension of this idea of thinking about how, as photographers, we can impact, we can have an impact on what images should go out there, because we decided quite early on that we would try and publish it ourselves rather than start looking for publishers. So we never shopped it around. We just went through the process of figuring out, you know, how to get it done. And I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that was one of the benefits of working collaboratively. We felt like between the two of us, we could manage that heavy lift, whereas, you know, I doubt that I would have tried that just by myself. So there was a way in which we wanted to have an imprint and control, you know, the production of the book, with the idea that we could then work with other photographers who have this incredible archive of imagery from Harlem, and get their work out as well. You know, in being able to show them, hey, this is what we did. You know, we could also go through this process for your project. So that was, yeah, that's a huge part of the idea behind IDEH and wanting to see this through in the way that we have in terms of fundraising, commissioning the texts, hiring a designer, finding the printer, you know, and walking through all of those steps.
And have you got another project in mind with other photographers that you're talking about?
There are several photographers, both Isaac and I know. Many photographers live in Harlem, have been photographing in Harlem for decades, and just have not, either through whatever reason, you know, living their life, have not had the exposure. And we are thinking about starting to group a few of them to see whether we can develop a series of monographs with the idea of kind of owning the images and keeping them in Harlem under an imprint that is based in Harlem. So if anybody out there would like to help, that's one of the next things we're working on.
No, I find that quite interesting, and this is very good evidence for what is good in this crazy period we're going through, which nobody knows quite how to handle. But the whole idea that you can put the book, your book, on several different platforms is actually wonderful. It should reach more people that way. And the idea that you can do this yourselves is kind of like students no longer sending in slides. Nobody has slides anymore, but no longer doing that. They publish their own books. And I was really delighted. Last year, Aperture's prize books of the year included, I would think, maybe 40% of self-published books. It's a new, some of you must be students. There are many things to be discovered. There is a great future to be devised by you.
Well, the other thing I'll say about that was really helpful for us, and I think for anyone who's out there thinking about working independently, is to get fiscal sponsorship. Very early in the process, we discerned that it would be best to move forward working underneath a nonprofit, the New York Foundation for the Arts. So we became a fiscally sponsored project of NYFA, which allowed us to go about fundraising and approaching corporate sponsorship, foundation, private family foundation sponsorship in an entirely new way. Doors were open to us in terms of money that really wouldn't have otherwise. And as well, you know, with so many people using Kickstarter and other platforms like that to raise money, NYFA had a relationship with Rocket Hub, which allowed us to raise money and also offer the tax incentives to people who were already wanting to support the project. So it was just it was nice to be able to buy a book, but also get a tax benefit as well, or to give a gift to the project and get that tax benefit. That was very helpful. But fiscal sponsorship for many young artists, old artists, is proving to be a really helpful, useful model for getting big projects off the ground. And it's no surprise that filmmakers use that kind of structure all the time, who need to raise $50,000, $60,000, $100,000.
You know, I think Kickstarter is probably one of the best things that's come down the pike in the digital era, really, because it gets a large community behind the project, and it means that you don't have to go begging quite the same way.
Well, yes, you're still begging, but you're right. It's not the same. It has the veneer of technology over it, but
Yeah.
it's you're asking.
Have you gone back to 35 millimeter? Either of you?
Well, I work with a digital SLR, which is the equivalent of 35 millimeter. Yes, I use my old lenses, my old Nikon lenses, on a new digital camera, and yeah.
Is it all color, Edward?
Unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, yes. For the first 10 years I photographed, it was all black and white. So I'm one of those photographers that has a drawer full of archives. And for years I would say black and white photography is sacred and everything else is profane. And now I've become profane.
And you, Isaac?
Yes, I shoot digitally now with a kind of 35 millimeter rangefinder camera, but also we've made, for our next project, which is in Detroit, we're going to be working with basically a medium format back on a technical camera. So basically you have the movements of a 4.5-ish with the resolution of that as well, but digitally.
Oh.
So.
And what are you going to do? Are you going to look for Detroit's Harlem?
No, this is a very different project, primarily because we'll be photographing interiors. We're going to Detroit primarily to photograph interiors. So, I mean, as you know, there's a lot being done in Detroit, and pretty much it's basically about ruins. As glorious as they may be for photographers, it's like been done. So we're taking a slightly different tact, still looking at this idea of black space, but looking at techno and the history of techno music, electronic music, which basically was invented in Detroit. Techno was created in Detroit primarily amongst a group of African-American kids at the time, and the music has just ballooned into what it is today. So we're going there to kind of tell that story photographically, and probably using some other tools as well.
That's very interesting. I think you'll find a lot of people know nothing about that, myself included.
Well, I think the intention is the same as this Harlem project, in the sense that we're interested in how cultural signs are keeping communities alive. So you could look at Detroit from the kind of mega capital model, and it's gone bankrupt and it becomes the media story. Or you could look at the last 30, 40 years of Detroit through the lens of this techno black music, which has spawned a multi-billion-dollar dance industry, which of course is no longer black. So there's a kind of similar story here, where there's a rootedness of something that's strong, that has a global cultural brand behind it, but is completely ignored as a storyline. So if we can start looking at a city that is being defined as being the first mega American city that we're watching it die, and what is going to become, to look at that same city and say, well, look what it's been doing all this time. then you can start rethinking about how you look at places.
Well, you've been so interested in history in a way anyway, and one of the things that fascinates me about this work is it's kind of proleptic. You are preservationist. You are photographing the present so that it won't be lost in the future, which I think has been one part of city photography for a long time. Because 10 years from now, if everything goes as it apparently is going to go, people will not know this. I mean, in 2 years, 4 years, the wall for Michael Jackson left. Did it go to the Smithsonian? There was talk about that.
Yes, there was talk that they would buy it, and I believe that they've
Anyway,
kept
that
the
whole
wall.
block changed its character. And young people will never know that it was another way unless they have got this kind of a picture. And that's going to be true maybe of the entire block, depending on what really happens in this project and how many developers come in. The meeting I was at before I came here was a discussion about city planning in Paris and in New York and how different they are. I mean, Bloomberg's middle of the city plan got offed, which I think was, from my mind, was a good thing. But the statement was, the opinion was that New York is all about money. Paris is not all about money. I think they had to resurrect Malraux. He was the cultural minister who said you can't build over the certain height. That's why it has the charm that it does. But New York keeps going up. 90 stories is the next new building. You know, it strikes me as sort of crazy, but it is because people can make money on that. And it's a whole different way of looking at the city. There is not much, in this city, it seems to me, there's not much backing for aesthetics. I don't know what's going to happen. If Renzo Piano is designing that museum, it should be good. He's a wonderful architect. But by and large, that's not what dominates. What dominates is what works, what will make money, period. And aesthetics doesn't always enter into that equation.
Yes, unfortunately, that is the current reality most everywhere, except in cities like Paris and Rome, and I mean even London has been pretty much decimated most places. But I think that's a new kind of global phenomenon, right? Because I think Isaac alluded to it before. Cities are now becoming places where money can come in and park itself. It's there was a New Yorker or New York article in New York Magazine about cities being the new Swiss bank account.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So that really circulated, and it hit home a point that we have to start thinking about the places we live. And by cities, we don't just mean the inner city. By cities, we mean the boroughs. Just how does that functionality work, so that these places, these street corners, remain alive and like living organisms?
Yes, because in New York City, and I hear particularly in London, people park their money and then don't go live there. So there are many, many, many unoccupied, magnificent apartments. And that's a big change for cities, I think. They become more and more crowded, but now in the upper parts, they are becoming less crowded in some ways. And I don't know what happens. I don't remember this.
Well, this is probably an appropriate place to end, in that this is an early Polaroid of M&G's Diner, which was in that first image that we showed, taken from the inside, just kind of weeks before it disappeared.
Before M&G's disappeared?
Yeah, M&G's is gone. It's now a fairly ordinary glass storefront with nothing inside. So for rent, yeah. So this was one of the only Polaroids we ever made during our initial.
Yeah, the place was there
outside.
for 38 years, actually, and it was one of those cultish places that people would go to at the end of the night. Their smothered chicken was the best in the city, and so when it closed down, a lot of people were saddened about it. And so there's a whole conversation on social media. So you can go to YouTube, to internet, and Google M&G's Diner, and you'll see the conversation about its demise and its ending. and people remembering what they ate there and when they were there.
Some of which is included in the back of the book, just as a kind of mini appendix, but yeah.
It's interesting to see. I presume when you say a Polaroid, you're not talking about the 20 by 24 Polaroids. To see a Polaroid this big is a little unsettling.
No, it's a much smaller one. So,
well,
thank you.
If we want to bring this to the close, I should say, first of all, do any of you have questions for these two gentlemen?
About corporate sponsorship, what resonates the most with sponsors you've talked to in like the 1K to 10K range? Because I know on Kickstarter and stuff, I can easily sell a book for $30 because I'm giving them a book, they're sponsoring something by an independent photographer. But if I'm looking to raise a little bit more money, what did you find sponsors like to hear? Do they want their little byline in the book saying, we helped this photographer out? Is it going and emceeing a dinner for them? What did you guys find worked the best?
We created a prototype of the book. We had 7 digital books made by the same printer, so that they looked like the final book. And I think they cost us like $350 a book. And so we had this tool that then we can go to a corporate sponsor and say, will you purchase 20 books? Will you purchase 10 books? 10 books at $75 a book is $750. So with the help of one of our friends' moms sitting here, we managed to reach out to 6 corporate entities who each bought pre-purchased 20 books.
Wow.
So that we created a corporate edition with their logos of 120 books. So of the 1,000 books first edition, 120 of them were given out, pre-sold and given out immediately with the logos of the 6 corporations. So you need to think about whatever your subject matter is and who would be interested
Right.
in that product, and be businesslike about it, because corporations are looking for branding, for marketing, for something they can give away or be proud of.
And just to piggyback on that, the key really for us was finding a cheerleader in that circle, right?
From the community in Harlem or
yes,
in the corporate?
finding a cheerleader in Harlem who could reach out to the various companies in Harlem on our behalf. Because we were very clear, hey, we're dealing with 125th Street, we're dealing with Harlem. A lot of national companies want to be here. Not a lot of national companies we thought would be interested in the project. None of them gave us squat until we had someone in that community, from that business community, who would cheerlead the project. So they weren't interested in meeting with us until after the fact. They wanted to get a certain level of validation that this was okay, that someone had put their foot into the water, and then it made it okay for them to do that. So find that cheerleader.
Thank you so much.
Yep. And it was interesting. It was, in some cases, it was as easy as a phone call. X gave Y a phone call, and suddenly we had money.
We've seen how Harlem has changed, and we've heard how Harlem has changed. I'm just interested in how your working relationship changed over the 4 years, how you thought about photography, how you thought about Harlem, how all that kind of changed.
Initially, as I said, we went out with one camera. We would both go out at the same time, and we would talk about these pictures we wanted to make. And initially, it was an argument. It was like, I see it this way, I see it that way. Why are we making this picture? We should be making the other picture. And as we continued to work together, it was almost as if a third brain was created. So instead of fighting one another or really being opposed to one another's ideas and going in faith, okay, you want to do this, we're going to do it, it became more of, okay, we're both seeing the same thing, we're both feeling that, okay, I understand why you want to make that picture, I want to make that picture. So it was this kind of melding of two different minds into this other thing. And that, I think that's what, at least I wanted a collaboration to be about. It's like 1 + 1 = 3. And so that happened.
How has that changed? Well, we haven't photographed much together, except we're starting again since we made those pictures. But I think the interaction was a big part of what the pictures ended up looking like, because as you said it yourself, these pictures took a lot of time to make, so we couldn't make that picture plus the other one. We had to make a decision on which one to, because of the time it would take, the lighting would change. We didn't have that much time. We both had other jobs, other commitments, so those days were precious for us. I think we started to understand what we were doing as we were doing it, as often happens in documentary work, whether it's writing history or you know, shooting any kind of subject matter, photojournalists out. You kind of start to see what the story is as you are working on it, and so that automatically puts you together, whether you're you know, a director with a DP and a sound man, or whether you're two photographers working. It just starts to gel together. So more of your time is based on production.
If you started with an idea, did you end up with another idea?
We didn't want to start with an idea. We wanted to master the 4x5, but not be prisoner to its formal attributes. Mm-hmm. We wanted to explore the street the way we had been each doing in the past, but we wanted to use this camera. So we were bringing these kind of dialectical issues together and seeing what would happen as we started exploring them. So I think we were very close to the same idea. I mean, as you saw, I'll repeat, you know, Isaac's last photograph said Harlem not for sale. And that was probably done in 2004. And so we were dealing with this issue of gentrification without making overtly political photographs. And we were also aware of how those issues would impact the community people and the business people who were now coming to invest, to borrow, to take a risk, to build, to think about what the place should look like. You know, so you think about these things in making the photographs. Just like a war photographer would think about, how should I deal with this corpse here? Like, what do I want to say?
You started as much with the notion of how are we going to make a photograph as you did with the notion of what should be about, is what it sounds like.
I think that's right. As we move forward in, say, photographing Detroit, we had a long conversation around, well, given the subject matter, does it make sense to use film or does it make sense to shoot digitally? Not just for the convenience sake, but in terms of, well, what conceptually makes sense, given the history of techno, given what these artists are using, and that whole history of shifting from analog to primarily digital technology. So, you know, it kind of, I think, at least for me, to think about both things is pretty exciting.
Well, let's come to an exciting conclusion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming out.
Could photograph at a time under a black cloth, but still they would spend up to an hour beforehand deciding what lens to use, where to stand, what angle to use, what f-stop to use, et cetera, and so forth. So it was a real collaboration. And if you haven't seen the book, you ought to, because it's a really good book. Now, do you want to open with a photograph? Oh, you've got one.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Vicki, for being here. Thank you to SVA and to Stephen, especially for long supporting my work and now my collaboration with Edward. As you said, I've been teaching here since 2000, and I'll be forever grateful for the opportunity you gave me in grad school to teach. So thank you. But yeah, we wanted to just start out showing work that we had been doing independently in Harlem specifically before meeting, because I think one of the interesting things about our collaboration is that we each have had many years thinking about Harlem, visualizing Harlem, before we actually came together to work in Harlem. So as Vicki alluded to earlier, I moved to Harlem in the mid-90s and started off very much in that solitary photographer walking the streets of Harlem, making black and white 35mm pictures. And I started doing that simply because I moved to Harlem. I moved to New York in 1990 to go to college on the Upper West Side. Upon graduating in '94, I moved to Harlem, and I was there. And it was suddenly an opportunity to not only investigate a neighborhood that I was very much attracted to, but also a way to practice using a camera. I didn't study photography as an undergraduate, so
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the School of Visual Arts Theater. Thank you for being here. I suspect there's some people who intended to come, but they're across the hall with the VIP crowd. But they'll wander in as the evening goes on. My name is Stephen Fraley. I'm the chair of the BFA Photography Department. I just want to make a brief introduction of our guests this evening. And I also want to make mention that after the presentation, they will be in the lobby with the newly released book, and they'll be signing some copies. But before they begin, please allow me to introduce our guests, starting with Isaac Diggs. Isaac's work is in the collections of the New York Public Library and the Walker Art Center. His work has received support from the Asian Cultural Council, the Center for Photography at Woodstock, and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. He received an MFA from Bard College and has been on the faculty of the BFA photography program at SVA since 2000, which is absolutely astonishing. Edward Hillel has received many awards, including the German Critics Visual Arts Prize and the Golden Sheaf Film Award. His work is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the National Archives in France, among many other public collections. He is currently the founder and director of the Harlem Biennale. Last, but certainly not least, Vicki Goldberg was the photography columnist of the New York Times and has written numerous articles on photography for Vanity Fair and American Photographer. Her most recent book, Light Matters, is a collection of essays and was published by Aperture. Vicki has received the Infinity Award from the ICP in 1997. Please welcome all three of them here this evening.
things that drew my attention. In early 2000s, like 2004, I believe, I got a grant to go to Japan through the Asian Cultural Council to study with Daido Moriyama for about 10 weeks. And that was really pivotal to me. I'd been thinking a lot about Moriyama's street photography and the example of Japanese post-World War II photography and how transformational that had been. And I really wanted to study with him to see how his thinking about a language of photography could be translated in America, specifically to an African-American context, and thinking about how I might visualize what we're now thinking about as black space. So many of these pictures, some of them were made kind of 2004, 2005, upon coming back from that trip and really being more aware and conscious of the images I was accumulating and what they were saying in aggregate in terms of talking about African-American culture, talking about a specific place with a tremendous amount of history and culture that was kind of rapidly changing. In 2006, I moved out of Harlem. I moved upstate. And this kind of street work basically stopped. I was no longer living here. I no longer had the kind of daily access to the place that I once had. But Harlem was still on my mind, and I was kind of anxious to figure out a new way to approach it. And thankfully, it was around that time that I met Edward.
Hello, everyone. I also want to thank Stephen and SVA for being our de facto partners. Thanks.
I would like to tell you that the two photographers you see before you are a very unusual example of photographers because, for many reasons, one of them is they're essentially street photographers and it's a collaboration. Traditionally, street photography is single. Henri Cartier-Bresson was so reluctant to be known because he would be spotted that he didn't want his picture taken. And you can't do that when there are two of you wandering around. And can you imagine Walker Evans taking his worker pictures in Detroit with a sidekick? Or Deanne Arbus going out with somebody else? Or Frank? Or William Klein? I mean, it just scarcely happens. And besides that, they went out onto the street with a tripod and a 4x5, which is hardly something common either in street photography, which has been traditionally 35 millimeter, quick snap, snap. Now that everybody in the world is a street photographer, it's even harder to collaborate if you've got a cell phone. But besides that, there's a generation's difference in their age. That's not so uncommon. Aren't you different generations? I think you are. I'm a third one, for heaven's sakes. That you see that pretty often with photographers, somebody in midlife, somebody in their 20s, let's say, but that somebody is almost always an assistant. He's not photographing with you, he's carrying your lights and all your equipment. Excuse me. And then, you know, we have a black guy and a white guy who are photographing together out on the street in Harlem, and apparently that sometimes drew a crowd, which I find not so very surprising. Only one of them.
Late in college decision to pursue photography seemed a bit rash to my father, but upon graduating, I really had to figure out what that meant. So I got a job at Magnum Photos in their administrative offices in Chelsea, and would use my lunch period and after work to peruse the contact sheets that were there. So Cartier-Bresson, Salgado, etc. You know, I just kind of poured over their contact sheets and started making pictures. And I would do what I called a daily practice. Every morning before work, I'd get out and walk the streets of Harlem for a couple of hours. And then on the weekends, I would do the same, just to make photographs. I had no specific intention, no project per se, no book or exhibition idea. It was just a way to make pictures. And I really was attracted to the activity, the kind of public display of culture on the street. So I was very attracted to the signage, obviously, to the people, to the objects one would just simply come across walking through Harlem. And of course, in the mid-90s, Harlem was relatively neglected, especially in terms of the rest of the city. I mean, I can remember vividly looking at New York Magazine, maps of Manhattan would stop at 96th Street because nothing was going on above 96th Street, according to them. So Harlem was largely neglected. But in the later 90s, early 2000s, there was certainly an increase, an uptick in activity in terms of interest in the area. And I just really continued to make these pictures of public events, private moments,